Roll.
Senator Gardler, Senator
Here.
Carr, Senator McDaniel, Senator Mills, Senator Southworth, Senator Storm, Senator Thomas, Senator Wheeler,
Here.
Senator Wilson,
Here.
Senator Yates, Representative Baker, Representative Banta,
Here.
Representative Beckler, Representative Bojanowski, Representative Bray, Representative Brown, Representative Callaway,
Present.
Representative Cantrell, Representative Elliott, Representative Freeland,
Present.
Representative Gentry,
Here.
Representative Hart,
Here.
Representative Huff,
Here.
Representative Johnson,
Here.
Representative King,
Present.
Representative Kulkarni,
Present.
Representative Lawrence,
Present.
Representative Lockett,
Present.
Representative Rowland, Representative Sharp,
Present.
Representative Sheldon, Representative Tackett Lafferty, Representative Truitt,
Present.
Co-Chair Schroeder, Co-Chair Weber.
Here.
Members, thank you for being here. 9 a.m. meeting this morning. And we're going to go in the order of the agenda. Oh, first we need to approve the minutes from last meeting. We have a motion. We have a second. Appreciate that. All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, minutes are approved. Next, we will go down to number 3. We have a report, an update from the Education and Labor Cabinet. Welcome. Thank you for being here this morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My
Morning.
name is Jamie Link. I'm the Secretary of the Education and Labor Cabinet. We appreciate the opportunity to appear today and give you a brief update on the merger of the Kentucky Education and Labor Cabinet, as well as an update on state-sponsored workforce development programs. So with that, we'll get started, and I'll allow my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. My name is Sam Flynn. I'm Chief of Staff and General Counsel for the Education and Labor Cabinet.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Matt Berry. I'm the Research Director for the Kentucky Center for Statistics, or KY Stats.
So we'll start with the merger of the Kentucky Education and Labor Cabinet, which was a reorganization of the Kentucky Labor Cabinet and the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet. And I would like to acknowledge the support from Senator Mike Nemes and Representative Russell Weber for their assistance with our reorganization bill. And this was based upon a vision Governor Beshear had to strengthen Kentucky's workforce development approach by combining both the Labor and Education and Workforce Development Cabinets. And as you will see in the presentation, the way we see this, I don't like to read PowerPoints if that's okay with you. The way I see this is it allows our cabinet to address the entire workforce continuum, from early childhood education through primary and secondary education, through career and technical education, apprenticeship, to job placement, and then after employment, the protections of workplace safety, wage and hour protections, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance. So with our mission there, you can see those 4 tenets of educate, encourage, employ, and enforce that I just covered. With the reorganization, you will see on this slide, we're comprised of 10 major organizational units. You can see those there. Again, I don't need to read those for you, I don't believe. With a total of 1,539 filled positions. This is not including the Department of Education, which is administratively attached to our cabinet, but obviously they're governed by the board as well as the commissioner. And you can also see on the right-hand side of the slide our funding model with federal, general, restricted, workers' compensation, and tobacco settlement funding for a total of $853 million. My presentation was short, so now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Matt Berry and our Chief of Staff and General Counsel Sam Flynn to talk about state-sponsored workforce development programs.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you all. So, as many of you know, in the budget bill that was passed this past session, the Education and Labor Cabinet was allocated or appropriated $500,000 to conduct a study of state-sponsored workforce development programs, and was directed to work in collaboration with Sieber out of the University of Kentucky, and I noticed that Dr. Clark is here as well, and we appreciate his support. And the first sort of task in this was to identify sort of what our criteria are for determining what is a truly state-sponsored workforce development program. A lot of money comes through state government, from the federal government for workforce development. WIOA, Wagner-Pfizer, funding sources like this. But the bill directs us to look at truly state-sponsored workforce development programs. So in conjunction with Kentucky Center for Statistics and the University of Kentucky, in the past months, we've gotten together and started looking at sort of what our criteria are for determining what those state-sponsored workforce development programs are. And as you'll see on the slides, and I also don't like to read off PowerPoint presentations, the criteria that we've come to is, first, there has to be a general fund appropriation, right? It's state-sponsored. The second piece is, again, it's sponsored, so it needs to be the majority funded by state dollars, general fund appropriations. The next piece is it does have to have a workforce development impact, right? We're looking at workforce development programs. But the key there is also that it has to truly be directed at workforce development programmatic issues. So we've worked together in conjunction with Dr. Clark and the University of Kentucky and obviously the Kentucky Center for Statistics to formulate these criteria. And the next sort of step in this process is we'll be looking at the whole of state government. We've begun with truly the Education and Labor Cabinet. We'll be looking at the entirety of state government to determine which programs truly sort of fit into that bucket. Again, when we look at these programs, there are going to be limitations to sort of the study and what we're able to do. Some of those are going to be based on the availability of data, and with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, and he can discuss a little bit more about that.
Sure, thanks, Sam. I think prior to a discussion of limitations, I think it's good for us to acknowledge how fortunate we are here in Kentucky to have the robust longitudinal data system that we do have. It has very little to do with me, so that's not me bragging on myself. But we are very lucky. We have one of the nation's most robust systems. It includes data from agencies and partners across the state. Many of the data sources go back 10 years or more. It includes data from sources from post-secondary education, K-12 education, adult education, apprenticeship, unemployment insurance, just to name a few, that I think could be specifically helpful for the purpose of this study. However, we don't have everything, as hard as we try. We don't have all data. And so, and it does take some time to identify new data sources, to structure agreements, to secure new data sources, to actually get the data, and then, of course, to integrate it into the system. And so, as Sam referenced, we think that the best approach in this instance is to, as we identify the programs which meet these 4 criteria, also ask, for which of those programs do we already have data that exist in our system? And that way we'll be able to design robust methodologies and produce analyses that I think will be impactful for this purpose within the window that has been laid out for us. And I think Sam will talk a little bit more about our updates and next steps here.
Certainly. Thank you, Matt. So sort of what we're looking at now is the next steps. And again, what I referenced earlier is identifying sort of across state government the entirety of the workforce impacted programs, or the programs that directly impact workforce development and do receive state funds. And from there, we can start to sort of fill up the bucket, so to speak, of the programs that meet our specific criteria. So it's, if we're looking at the Justice Cabinet and there's a program for justice-involved folks, is there a general fund appropriation? Is it 51% or more general fund appropriation? Is it directly related to impacting workforce development outcomes? And once we've sort of figured out what's entirety of our bucket across state government, then we're going to start looking at what is what is the universe within that smaller bucket of programs where we have active data already. And I, obviously I want to commend Kentucky Center for Statistics. They do a fantastic job. They do have a lot of data, but there are going to be programs that likely we do not have data on, that are going to, that are obviously designed to meet this new bill and the requirements of this study. So we will have to put agreements in place to exchange data, and we do anticipate to have sort of that universe that's going to be in our bucket, so to speak, together by January of 2023, and then we'll begin sort of working with the University of Kentucky and KY Stats to a greater extent to determine what data is out there and what programs we can start looking at.
So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes our comments, our presentation, and we'd be happy to address any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'll lead us off with questions, and General Counsel Flynn, I'll begin with you because you kind of ended it and using the term universe. I know, you had mentioned we're still trying to get an idea of just how big the universe is. So this question might be a little bit difficult, but I mean, once, you're going to have the goals and the scope by January 2023, do we have any idea the length of time once we have those projections of, actually determining if things are working as they should be, or if we need to tweak things, or maybe some certain programs aren't working at all? The whole purpose of the budget language in there. Do we have any idea how long that would take, I guess?
Well, we're sort of restricted by the budget language. Obviously, we have to have a report back to the legislature by December 1 of 2023. So we're sort of working with that universe. I do think that at some point, if we determine that more time is needed to study, that's a conversation that we would like to have with the members of this committee. Whether it's extending that time period or revisiting it at some point, or constructing some studies in further legislative language that are directed at specific programs where we don't have data or that are going to take a larger period of time for us to address.
I guess along those same lines, you noted the relationships with University of Kentucky. Do you foresee in the future, after this first go around, after we have an idea of, you guys are developing the scope, the metrics, and everything like that, is this something that is going to be able to be done on a routine yearly basis internally, or will it always? Do you think we're always going to need University of Kentucky or another university to assist because the scope of the project is just that big?
And Senator, I appreciate the question. I think we might be putting the cart before the horse a little bit. We're not really going to be able to tell you whether the Education and Labor Cabinet and KY Stats can really do this kind of work until we've sort of dug into it.
I understand. We have a question from Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation here today. Going back to the 10 major organizational units, I had a question. Could you describe for me exactly how the Department of Education is administratively attached to you?
That is by statute, and I'll defer to my general counsel for that, but we do not govern the day-to-day operations of the department, of course. Policy is set by the Kentucky Board of Education, and Commissioner Glass and his administration conduct the daily operations of KDE. However, I do think it's incumbent upon the cabinet to support the department in any way possible, specifically when it comes to workforce development initiatives in the career and technical education. In fact, we met with them yesterday for over an hour talking about what more can the cabinet do in conjunction with the department to prepare young people for the next step, post-graduation, whether that be post-secondary education or employment or a combination of both. I do believe, although we don't have a day-to-day oversight over the department, we do have an obligation to work collaboratively with them, specifically for developing a workforce pipeline for Kentucky.
General Counsel?
Senator, I don't think I can answer it much better than that.
Okay. I just wanted to double check on that because when the department was set up, it was set up outside of the cabinet, outside of the governor, to be an independent organization. And the legislature constitutionally has the responsibility for education in the state of Kentucky. And because we make the policy and we also fund it too as well. So I'm just trying to make sure that this connection is a collaborative connection and not an authoritative connection.
I can assure you it's not. No.
Okay, thank you.
I want to go back to the 4 guidelines you had discussed, and it's number 2. You said the majority of the fund needs to come from the general fund, so state-sponsored, which makes, I think that makes sense to get started. I understand it's using your term universe. It's a big universe out there. But do you think in the future there'll be an opportunity for those that are, below the 51% threshold to go back and really start looking at everything? I mean, in a perfect world with unlimited time and resources, we would, as the General Assembly, be able to have a report that every amount of our funding, we're seeing the ROI on that. And I guess looking out, again, maybe because we don't have this first part done, but I guess in the future, do you foresee maybe the ability to go back and look at the ones that are below that funding level?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that's absolutely a conversation that can and likely should be had once we see sort of what the dynamics are with this study and the limitations, but also the data that we receive on this piece. As you're well aware and as you alluded to, and I was speaking with Jeff Harmon, who it's always good to see here earlier. We have so many funding streams for workforce development programs that truly are federal in nature. The Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, perfect example, $74 million that flow through the cabinet and the Office of the KWIB to the local workforce boards, and that's an area that obviously we could take a look at in future years, assuming that, and again, this is a big assumption, that after we've gone through sort of this study that we believe that, obviously we have the bandwidth to accomplish that. But again, that's going to be a determination that's made after we see sort of what the time and resources are for this study.
Thank you. Members, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we appreciate your time this morning. I found it helpful and look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Michael Clark, the Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research. Good morning, Mr. Clark. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Take just a moment to change out the presentation here.
Absolutely.
Well, good morning. My name is Mike Clark.
Could you, I'm sorry, make sure that microphone is, the green light is lit up. Might need to pull it a little bit closer if it was already on. I'm not sure.
That's a rookie mistake. I should know
There
better
you go.
than that.
You're good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. You hear me now? Yeah. All right, good. Again, my name is Mike Clark. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of Kentucky, and I'm also the director for the Center for Business and Economic Research at UK. For those of you who are not familiar with our center, we basically do applied economic and policy research for various government agencies, business groups, and community groups across the state. We're frequently asked to come and testify about the state of the economy, or present to different groups about how the economy is doing, and do a lot of different types of different research projects across a lot of different issues related to economics, the labor force, and so on. So today I was asked to come and talk a little bit about what we can potentially learn by evaluating workforce development programs. Now, when we think about workforce development programs, it's important to keep in mind that these programs cover a broad spectrum of different types of services. These can be programs that might focus on things that are often referred to as soft skills, such as how do you find a job? How do you write a resume, do interviews, things that really are kind of designed to help the worker understand how they can get into a job. Or they can be much more intensive programs where we're really trying to help the worker develop skills that are going to be marketable in the labor force. So these different types of programs can provide a lot of different services. They vary across who they serve, what types of services they provide, and the intensity in which they provide those services. It's fairly common for states to go through and look at their workforce training programs to decide, or basically understand what type of an impact are we getting from these. And the evaluations that we typically see are generally trying to answer two basic questions. Now, not all studies will look at each of these questions, but most studies will look at this first question. That is, how do the programs affect labor market outcomes? Now, we hope these programs are going to do a number of things. One, we hope they're going to improve the employment. That is, are individuals who participate in these programs going to be more likely to find a job with the training than they would have in the absence of the training? So we hope maybe we're having an impact there. Second, how does it affect their wage rates? If we're helping the worker improve their skills, and these are skills that are valued in the market, then we hope what is going to happen is that their wages are going to increase. And we might also see as their skills improve that they might be working more hours. All these are different ways that these labor force programs can go through and affect the individuals by increasing their earnings. So the real goal here is to understand, through whatever mechanism it might actually operate, how do these programs affect the earnings? All these are different types of labor market outcomes. There are other types that we might be concerned about, but these are kind of the primary ones that researchers look at when evaluating these programs. Now, some studies will take this a bit further. Not all studies do this, but some will try to answer this second question. That is, how do the benefits exceed the costs of these programs? So the idea is to get at the issue that was mentioned by Chairman Schroeder earlier. What is the return on investment of these programs? These programs consume resources, from state, local, federal governments. They may actually cost the individual participants, depending on the type of the program, but they're consuming resources. What we want to understand is, what are the benefits that we're going to get from this, whether this be to the individual participant or maybe the state, and determine what exactly is that return on investment. And we often look at this in terms of the present value. I'll discuss these things in a little bit more detail in just a moment. Now, when we're looking at these programs, it's important to understand we can look at them from a couple of different perspectives. The two primary perspectives we look at are the participant's perspective and kind of the government perspective, or the public perspective. From the participant's perspective, there are different types of costs and benefits that we might be interested in looking at. On the cost side, you can kind of imagine that if somebody is stopping what they're doing to invest in their training, in some kind of a training program, they're spending more time in maybe an apprenticeship program, or more time at a community technical college, or in any other type of training program, they might be spending less time actually working. And so one of the costs that they might incur in terms of participating in a training program is lost earnings for a period of time. That's a fairly natural thing that we have. We see this even when people are going on to earn a bachelor's. They're foregoing some earnings for a period of time with the hope or the expectation that that investment is going to change their earnings in the future. But it's a cost early on. There may be some additional fees, tuition associated with the program. And there are other costs as well. One type of cost is work-related expenditures. So you can imagine an individual who goes through a training program. They get out of the training program, they have more marketable skills, they're working more, they may incur additional transportation cost. That tends to eat away at maybe some of the earnings benefits they have. They may have additional child care costs because they're not at home caring for the kids as much. They might be working and therefore need someone to take care of their kids. So one of the things that, we might see costs pop up, or one of the types of costs that might pop up is work-related expenditures. And also, while they may be earning more, they may be giving up access to different types of government assistance. Now, those are some of the types of costs that they might see, but on the benefit side, these are the ones that we're pretty familiar with, or that we're really hoping are there. Higher earnings, and we're hoping these are higher earnings over a long period, over a long career, or higher fringe benefits. From the public or the government perspective, obviously there's some program costs associated with these. But also there can be some other types of costs that it's important for us to kind of understand. If the worker is, for a period of time, working less, they're probably generating slightly less tax revenues. This will tend to be maybe a small impact, but it is an impact nonetheless. And it tends to be a temporary impact that just occurs during the training program. Now, on the benefit side, we see additional tax revenues. If the program is successful at increasing the earnings, these individuals will be generating more in terms of tax revenues, and they may be reducing the dependency on different types of public assistance programs, so there is a potential fiscal impact there. And it's not necessarily the case that these types of benefits for the government necessarily pay for the cost. They might not, but they can potentially offset some of the cost of these programs. Now, these are just some of the different types of costs and benefits that these studies tend to look at. It's not all encompassing. If we sit here, we could probably brainstorm about a lot of different types of other benefits that might actually be much more difficult for us to get at, but are important nonetheless. One example of this is you think about an individual who maybe through a training program is more employable, that improves their access to employer-sponsored health insurance, which increases their access to medical care, which maybe improves their quality of life. These are benefits that may not show up in terms of measures that we can look at, like earnings, but they are benefits nonetheless. You can also think of an individual who maybe is working 2 jobs just to get by. If they participate in a training program that increases their wages, they may find they don't have to work 7 days a week. As a result of that, their earnings may not change much, but the hours that they work might decline. So they are able to spend more time with their family or leisure. These are clearly benefits to the individual that, again, may not show up in terms of earnings. So there's a lot of different types of costs and benefits. And typically what tends to happen with these studies is they look at as much as they can. But data limitations, as we're discussing in the previous presentation, do play into which of these you can actually analyze. Most studies will at least look at the earnings impact and the tax impact for the state. Okay, so I want to go through and talk with you a little bit about an example of how these impacts might affect labor market outcomes. And I'm going to focus on earnings. So we can kind of envision, this is all just made up data, it's just to kind of illustrate a point. We can kind of envision a worker who maybe is low income. Their wages might be going up for a period of time. And if they were to just kind of continue on that track without any type of additional training, their wages might kind of continue along that trend. Keeping up with inflation, some marginal increases in their earnings over time, but basically it just stays along that same track. If, however, they participate in the training program, we hope what's going to happen is that their wages are going to change. And again, here I'm kind of illustrating that for a brief period of time, earnings might be lower while they're investing in the training. But we hope, again, that we're going to have this long-term impact in terms of labor market outcomes. Specifically, we hope earnings are going to be higher. Now, as a researcher, what we're trying to do is determine what is the difference between these two paths. That's what we want to measure. That's what you want to understand in terms of thinking about this ROI. Is we're really trying to measure what are these differences. So typically the way this is done is we work with agencies like KY Stats to look at different types of labor outcomes in terms of employment or earnings to see what these things look like. So we might start with a group of individuals who participated in some type of a training program to observe what their wages were after the training program. Did they change? Did they go up? Now, a natural question you might be looking at as I'm reading through this is like, okay, that green line we see, right? Because they did the training program. We can observe what their wages were over a period of time after that. But that means they're no longer on that dotted blue line. We don't see that. Because they invested in the training, that dotted blue line is what would have happened in the absence of that training. So how do we get at that? Well, basically what we do is, in measuring these different types of labor market outcomes, or these impacts, we're comparing the outcomes of the individuals who participated in the programs to the individuals who did not participate. So participants versus non-participants. So much like when you're looking at some type of a healthcare medical procedure, if you're thinking about a study, you might look at a number of people, put them into two different groups. One is your treatment group, they receive the new medication. The other is your control group, they receive some type of placebo. If you do this and you do it well, you have a large number of people, you randomly assign them to this treatment in this control group, then what you anticipate is that those two groups ought to be pretty similar, where the only difference is the treatment that you provided. And then you can draw some really strong conclusions about the effect of that treatment. Now, in workforce training programs, we rarely get to randomly assign people to a training program versus not. It actually does happen sometimes, but rarely are we able to do that. So what researchers do is they typically rely on what we call non-experimental research designs. The idea is we're still going to have a treatment in a control group, but the control group is going to come from people who didn't participate in the program. These are going to be individuals who are very similar to those who did participate in the training program. As we go through and we try to find people who have similar demographics, similar experience and education levels prior to the training. And we use those as a comparison group. Or we might look at if there's eligibility criteria associated with the training program. We might look at those who just missed out, who are just a little bit above an income threshold, for example, as a control group. Now, this allows us, if we develop this control group very well, it allows us to make some really good conclusions or inferences about the effects of these programs. Now, there's still some things that we can't perfectly control for. We can't easily observe motivation, for example. So you can kind of imagine somebody who might participate in these programs as being more highly motivated than people who don't. People who are more highly motivated are more likely to go out and get training, but they're also more likely to go out and find a job or earnings. And so, that can be an issue. But generally, if we go through and we develop these control groups very well, we can do a good job in terms of inferring the impacts of the training programs. So, in terms of this individual, where we're trying to understand how their earnings were affected, the green line, which represents what they would earn with the training program, comes from actually seeing what their earnings were over a period of time. The dotted blue line comes from non-participants who have been carefully selected to be a good control group. So here's an example of some of the results that came from a similar study done in Washington State. Now, Washington State evaluates their programs on a 5-year basis. And they've got a lot of different programs, much like Kentucky, but here are three. One focused on adults, one on dislocated workers, and the last one on youth. And so what they evaluated was, how did it affect employment? And for the adult program, what they found is that the population who participated in the program were 4.1 percentage points more likely to be employed than similar people who did not. So I don't know what the kind of the baseline is, but if you kind of think about, okay, this population that was targeted for this training, if they had an employment rate of about 50%, this would mean that they, after participating in the program, have an employment rate of about 54%. So a pretty significant increase in terms of the employability of these individual workers. This also increased their earnings. This study found that the impact on earnings was about $1,300 per quarter. So this particular program for adults increased their earnings. Now, these results were observed over a about 9 to 12 quarters, so roughly a 3-year period after exiting the program. Now, it's important to recognize that these different types of effects, they're going to differ across different types of people and different types of programs. What works for older workers may not be applicable to younger workers and vice versa. Also, programs across different types of states are going to differ in terms of the types of services they provide, how they provide it, what populations they target, and the intensity of the services that are provided. So we have to be careful about drawing conclusions from different states. That's useful information, but we have to understand the context. As we go through and we evaluate these different labor market impacts, or the various types of costs and benefits that we look at, we want to do this over time. So here, again, it's just some hypothetical data that kind of illustrates what this might look like. We might observe cost in the early parts of participating in the program, right? The idea is, again, there's cost to the state of providing the program. There may be lost wages for the worker. So there's cost early on. Again, what we hope is that this is going to increase their earnings long into the future. So the idea when we go through and we start looking at what kind of a return on investment do we get is we have these upfront costs and we have what we hope are long-term benefits associated with these. Because we're looking at different periods, we have to be careful in terms of analyzing this. We have to basically discount those benefits that might accrue long into the future. If earnings go up by or $2,400 10 years from now, that's good, but that's 10 years from now. We can't count that as $2,400 right now. We have to discount that. So what we do is we go through and we calculate what we call a net present value. And ultimately what we're trying to understand is when we look at this on the net present, on a present value basis, do the benefits exceed the cost? As these programs are taking resources to be able to fund, they're potentially costing the worker. Do the benefits associated with those exceed the cost? If the net present value is greater than 0, it's basically telling you that yes, it is returning more in terms of benefits than what we're giving up in terms of cost to fund the program and what the worker is losing in terms of wages. If it's less than 0, however, it means that the cost of the resources are actually greater than the benefits that we receive. And so that would be a program that you'd want to determine whether you need to make changes or if you want to continue funding it. All right, so I want to go back to Washington State to give you a sense of what this looked like for them. They went through and they looked at the impacts, but then they turned this into costs and benefits. What does this mean on a present value dollar basis? Now, these results, they are present value. They also only represent the benefits and costs over the first 2.5 years participating in the program. So from the participants' perspective, what they found is that if you sum up all the wages that they are going to earn over the first 2.5 years, you discount those appropriately, the worker gains about $16,000. The cost, which is for the participant, primarily tuition, fees that they have to pay and the lost earnings, that totals about $6,800. So from the participant's perspective, there's a gain of about $9,000 to participating in this program. For the public, the cost was about $4,400. The benefits in terms of additional tax benefits or tax revenues and reduction in terms of public assistance, they estimated to be about $7,500. So in this particular program, the government gains as well, again, on a present value basis. You total those up and what you see is that the total present value net benefit of participating in this program was estimated to be about $12,000, $13,000 per participant. Now, one of the things they did is they basically said, all right, well, this is 2.5 years. But we hope that this program is going to provide benefits long into the future, over the entire life of the career, life career of this individual. Now, the costs are all borne at the beginning. So if it improves wages over the entire life, the benefits might actually be much larger. So what they did is they basically said, all right, well, let's calculate that, assuming that these effects last. So in this particular case, what they found is that when you do that, when you look over an entire career participating in this program, they estimated would benefit society by about $89,000 when you look at the benefits to both the participant and to the state, net of the costs that they incur. Now, there's a couple of issues that we've got to be careful about understanding when we're looking at this type of analysis. The first, short-term versus long-term. I told you in Washington State, they did their analysis looking at the earnings over about a 3-year period. That's fairly typical. Most research studies look at a period of about 1 to 3 years, and they get really good information about that. It's really hard to see how wages changed over a 10-year period or a 20-year period. It's just hard to kind of keep up with these individuals and to actually see how their wages changed over a long run period of time. And the thing is, it's not a guarantee that these effects are going to be permanent. These effects might actually decline over time, particularly if you're focusing on youth programs. Impacts that you might have for youth, it might give them a boost for a while, but it might be that their peers who didn't participate might actually catch up at some point in time. So we've got to be careful about interpreting these short run and these long-term impacts. The other issue is that when we are engaging in training programs and training more workers, we could actually be having additional labor market effects. This is potentially good for the worker, right? Because what we're doing is we're increasing their wages. But as we produce more workers with these different types of skills, in some occupations, we might see that this could displace existing workers, or it could actually have an effect on the market wages. You're basically increasing the supply. Now, I tend to think these effects are not necessarily large. They're something to be mindful of. When you're in a tight labor market like we are now, they're likely to be relatively small, if not insignificant in terms of an effect. But if you have a labor market or an occupation where there is an ample supply of workers already and you're training more, this might be more of a concern. But again, you're probably not training so many workers relative to the size of the labor market that it's necessarily a significant thing, but it's something to be aware of. So going back to our two primary questions, how do these programs affect labor market outcomes, and do the benefits exceed the cost? The idea behind doing these evaluations is to provide you, the policymakers, and the officials at the cabinets who administer these programs information to identify both strengths and weaknesses in terms of how these operate. That is, if you're seeing that the effects are not large, you can start looking at why are they not large, why are they not working. And while I showed you one program that in Washington State they estimated to have a positive effect, that's not always the case. There have been several studies, one particular category of programs called Education First, mandatory Education First programs. These were programs that were done in several states where the idea was you have these welfare recipients. You want to train them, give them some skills early on before they start looking for work, and hope that that gives them a leg up in terms of finding work and increasing their earnings. What they found is that these studies didn't actually work. The benefits to the workers were smaller than the cost incurred to support these programs. So it's not a guarantee that the programs actually work. A lot do, some don't. In this particular case, the researchers weren't entirely clear why these didn't work, but they speculated that part of the problem may be the types of skills that they were trying to provide. In these cases, these states, these programs were trying to provide preparatory GED training or some basic adult education. And they suggested that what may be happening is that these skills that were being provided by these training programs were just relatively low skills, that they didn't really provide them much of an advantage over their peers not participating in these programs, and did not translate into skills that employers were looking to pay additional wages for. So this type of analysis can give you an understanding of what works, what doesn't work, how big the impacts are. But it also helps you understand what that rate of return is on these. And so it helps you think about how you allocate resources, scarce resources, to programs that can potentially yield the largest benefits. Now, Chairman Schroeder, that concludes my comments. I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'll lead off again with the first question. I'm curious, so is it possible to, I think you're well aware of what we have tasked with that budget language. Are we, at this point, do we have to just look at programs, say, okay, here's our control group going forward, or is it possible to go back and say, well, we can see the control group here that didn't, sign up for the training, Basically, are we able to look back, or is it from this day forward we're going to have to wait a while for the outcome?
Fortunately, you're well positioned to be able to develop a control group from historical data. As you heard in the earlier presentation, KY Stats has done really a phenomenal job of building a data infrastructure that allows you to do this type of research. So, again, there may be some limitations in terms of what we can do, in terms of what data is collected, but they do have a good start at this. They have a lot of historical data. They've done a really great job, and I will say researchers across the state are just, really thrilled with this data because it allows them to do this type of research. So yes, I think the idea is to go back and look at programs where, maybe they've existed for a period of time, because, if you're looking at a program, for example, that you just started last year, we don't have a whole lot of history after they completed the program to evaluate that program. Just, if they completed this, maybe in July, we only have a few months of wage data. But what we can do is we can look at programs that you've been funding for a period of time, see graduates who maybe left, or those who left the program maybe in 2016, for example, see what their wages look like over the next few years, and find a control group from data from 2016 for people who are very similar to those who participated in the program. So we can develop control groups, at least in theory, we can develop control groups to do just that.
Great, thank you. Representative King?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Clark, for being here today. I noticed the citation date for the Washington State study was 2017. So my looming question and concern going forward is, with the massive disruptions across every sector, the labor market, employees, employers, are we going to be able to have accurate data points to actually do these studies? I know about this much about statistics, but I know you've got to have accurate data points to have accurate results. Can you speak to that a little
Sure.
bit? Thank you.
Yes, I think we can. Now, that's something that you are correct. When we're going through and looking at data, and I've been doing this with Lexington a lot, is we've got this big asterisk around 2020, 2021, and a lot of things changed, and certainly we need to be aware of that as we're analyzing it. A couple of ways that we can do that is, one, to analyze it prior to the pandemic, and kind of see, in normal situations, how did these things work. The other is to see exactly, well, how did these things help people fare as they were moving through the pandemic, through a very disruptive period? Did it help them remain employed compared to people who didn't participate in the program? So there's a lot that we can learn by observing individuals as they kind of move through, the ups and downs of the pandemic. So yes, it's something that we're going to have to be mindful of, and it could affect what we present to you. And that, as we're going through and looking at data that maybe was collected during that disruption, we'll have to kind of acknowledge that, yes, there are some caveats. Those were unusual times, but here's still what this can potentially tell us about the effectiveness of these programs moving forward.
Senator Southworth.
Thank you. I really appreciate this presentation because I've long been concerned about the effectiveness and net present value of some of these programs. Am I correct in thinking that there may have been some studies along these lines, perhaps you all are involved or not, relating to various college degrees through the CPE, different programs that they've approved and things, or are we not, do we not have a mechanism for that right now?
That I don't know. That's a question I think CPE would have to answer. I know going years back, there have been some studies looking at the returns to degrees. In fact, back when I was a graduate student, so that's telling you how long ago this was. We would go back and we try to understand, okay, what did people who graduated from, the various public state institutions, what would their earnings look like compared to what they would have earned in the absence of this? And I think there have been, different attempts to kind of do similar types of stuff, but I don't know what the status of that is.
Okay, well, I appreciate, I'm looking forward to the workforce piece of this, and certainly if it hasn't been done recently, then we probably should look at trying to encourage our CPE or whatever folks to do something similar, because I know my generation, when I was in school, most of my friends graduating with master's degrees, you know, were doing things like working at Kroger and so forth. And, you know, whereas maybe at one point you needed that degree for the job, now I think we've almost got more degrees than jobs, or they're not the right ones or something, because people aren't really even working in their fields. And I just am concerned that the present value of all those investments probably aren't what people think they are. But anyway, something to look forward to. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Members, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Clark, we certainly appreciate your time today. Found it very informative. We look forward to the cabinet and the results that, you know, you guys' conclusions when you work together. And I think it's going to help the state move forward in the right direction. So we certainly appreciate everyone's time today. Members, this is my last meeting chairing, so I know I see a lot of tears in your eyes, but it's okay. I'll be around, and really just want to thank the staff. I think a lot of people wonder in Kentucky how we do it as part-time legislators. We know that part-time is really a misnomer, but we do it with our great LRC staff, and so thank you guys. And with that, our next meeting is November 17th, and we're adjourned.